John the Baptist was born a couple millennia later, we all know what he'd do when the long-anticipated Messiah finally showed up on the banks of the Jordan River. He'd take a selfie with Jesus and post it on Facebook, right? Hashtag the one who is to come. The image is absurd, of course, precisely because John continues to be such a countercultural figure. Yes, he cuts through all the external trimmings and trappings of the countdown to Christmas and gets right to the heart of the season. But in this age of selfies and self-promotion, of influencers and product placement, John the Baptist again does the unthinkable. He points not to himself, but to another. He draws the attention away from himself and places it firmly on the one who is to come, the Messiah, the Anointed One, the Christ. And that stands out for most of us, since we humans by nature are a rather self-centered lot. Technology doesn't help, of course. And in full disclosure, I did recently take a selfie in front of the Worth Avenue Christmas tree and put it on Facebook. But the selfie culture simply highlights and makes visible our own unflattering tendencies. I mean, be honest. How many of you, since arriving in your pew this morning, have thought about things you need to get done later today or this week before Christmas? That's not a terrible thing. We all are striving to be productive and we all have stuff to do. But even when we intentionally set aside time to reflect on life beyond the visible world, as we do when we enter through these doors, we often have trouble being fully present. Or how many of you have checked your phones since entering this sacred space? I haven't. Mostly because it would be embarrassing if I got caught. Which is why I never bring my phone into worship. Lead us not into temptation and all that. And I imagine it would have been tempting for John to get caught up in the moment here. His presence and actions had attracted a large crowd. And a lesser person couldn't help but say to himself, look at all these people who have come all this way out into the wilderness just to hear me. This must have been some heady stuff for an itinerant preacher who'd been plying his trade in relative anonymity. And then suddenly, a big crowd gathers, granted with a mix of motivations. Some came with open hearts and minds. Some came out of curiosity to gawk at the spectacle of the latest popular preacher. And some, like the ones in this encounter, have come to look for heresy in order to condemn and discredit. But John doesn't want to talk about himself. He wants to talk about Jesus. You know when you go to a dinner party and get seated next to someone who only wants to talk about him or herself? Has that ever happened to you? Someone who not once asked anything about your life, but continues on in a mind-numbing monologue. We've all sat next to that person. But John the Baptist is the opposite of that dinner guest, because it's not all about John, it's all about Jesus. The point is, we could all stand to point away from ourselves more often than we do. It's not all about us, ever. Even though we so often act as if it is, in our self-centeredness, our inward focus, our insecurity, our fear of looking foolish in front of others. Ultimately, it is all about Jesus Christ. So John brings that ever-important gift of perspective. He models for us a way of thinking beyond ourselves. And he does this simply by living into his calling as the one who prepares the way for the one who is to come. There's a word for what John is showing us here: humility. I think our culture sometimes views genuine humility as a sign of weakness. To be humble is seen as subjugating the fullness of your unique personality or allowing someone to run roughshod over you. Yet John offers us a model of faithful humility that isn't weak or groveling. There was certainly nothing timid or faint-hearted about John the Baptist. But this single-minded devotion to his task as the preparer of the way didn't depend on how many or how few people came out to listen to him. Even if he was literally a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, John would have gone about his calling with passion and conviction. Yes, you can fully be yourself in all your unique glory, even as you point to Jesus as the source of all life. But still, those who gathered to witness him preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins were certainly confused about his identity, and they start peppering him with questions, the upshot of which is, "Who are you?" Followed by, "Who do you think you are?" The indignant ones questioning John's credentials were part of the religious establishment, and they were none too pleased about this extracurricular activity happening out in the boonies. Yes, there was general hope that the Messiah would show up, but surely the ones wearing the fancy robes would be the first to hear of it. Not some locust-eating crazy guy in the wilderness. But then rarely does God do things by the book. So who was this man we know as the forerunner of the Messiah? In John's Gospel, we hear a lot about who he was not. In these few verses, we hear that John is not the light, not the Messiah, not Elijah, not Moses. It's almost a comical exchange as John keeps saying no over and over again. But then a picture begins to emerge. John is a witness. John is a testifier. John is a voice. In some ways, he's like a giant neon arrow pointing to Jesus, a spiritual sign pointing the way. And we do well to follow John's direction. Because when we do, two things happen. We're reminded that we are not actually the center of the universe. And we begin to move our inward focus out to other people. This is what makes following Jesus possible. And when we do so, we can't help but have compassion for those in need, for the poor and downtrodden, the hungry and oppressed, the homeless and the voiceless. John reminds us to see things from above, not just from our own limited perspective. He reminds us to turn our lenses outward, to move beyond ourselves, to view the world with compassion, to see everyone around us as a fellow child of God, which is hard to do when we're taking literal or metaphorical selfies all the time. As the light continues to build on the Advent wreath, I encourage you to tune in to John's voice crying out in the wilderness. Let it reorient you. And I promise you will be drawn ever closer to the Messiah.